Sebastian Clarke had always believed that karma was just a comforting lie people told themselves when justice seemed too slow to arrive. That was before he found the boarding pass tucked between the pages of his wife's cookbook, a cookbook that hadn't been opened in months, which made the discovery all the more curious. The ticket was for a flight to Miami, dated 3 weeks ago. First class. One way. The name printed on it wasn't Victoria's. He stood in their pristine kitchen, the pass trembling slightly in his manicured fingers, while the grandfather clock in the hallway marked another ordinary Tuesday evening. Victoria wouldn't be home for another hour. Her yoga class ran until 8, or so she claimed. Sebastian had never questioned it before. Why would he? After 12 years of marriage, trust had become as automatic as breathing. The ticket belonged to someone named James Morrison. Sebastian didn't recognize the name, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered melody that refused to surface completely. He photographed the boarding pass with his phone before carefully placing it back exactly where he'd found it, between pages 127 and 128, right next to a recipe for coq au vin that Victoria had never attempted. Over the next few days, Sebastian found himself paying attention to details he'd previously overlooked. Victoria's phone, which she now guarded more carefully. The subtle change in her perfume, something lighter, more youthful. The way she hummed in the shower, melodies he didn't recognize. Small things that, when assembled together, formed a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. He hired a private investigator without much internal debate. Gerald Hopkins came recommended by Sebastian's divorce attorney friend, though Sebastian hadn't mentioned the word divorce to anyone yet. Gerald was a former police detective with kind eyes and the sort of steady demeanor that suggested he'd seen enough human frailty to surprise him anymore. "Most of the time people already know what I'm going to find," Gerald had said during their first meeting at a downtown cafe. "They just need someone else to confirm it." Sebastian had nodded, stirring sugar into coffee he couldn't taste. "How long do these things usually take?" "Depends on how careful they're being. Your wife sounds careful." The investigation took 2 weeks. Gerald's report arrived in a manila envelope that Sebastian left unopened on his desk for 3 days, as if delaying the inevitable could somehow change its contents. When he finally broke the seal, he found photographs, phone records, and credit card statements that painted a picture of a double life conducted with impressive attention to detail. James Morrison was a tennis instructor at an upscale resort outside the city. 34 years old, divorced, no children. Victoria had been seeing him for 8 months. The Miami trip had been their romantic getaway, paid for with money from an account Sebastian didn't know existed. An account funded by small, regular transfers from their joint savings. The most damaging detail wasn't the affair itself, but the planning behind it. Victoria had been systematically moving money, creating a paper trail that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment long before she'd met James. Sebastian wasn't just being cheated on. He was being methodically dismantled. That evening, Victoria came home with her yoga mat slung over her shoulder and a story about traffic that delayed her usual arrival. She kissed Sebastian's cheek with lips that tasted like mint and deception, then disappeared upstairs to shower. Sebastian sat in his study, Gerald's report spread across his mahogany desk like evidence at a crime scene, and began to plan his response. He wasn't angry, which surprised him. Hurt, certainly. Disappointed, absolutely. But beneath those predictable emotions lay something cooler and more calculating. Victoria had played a careful game, and Sebastian had to admit he respected the strategy, even as it destroyed his life. Now it was his turn to play, and he intended to win. The first step was understanding exactly what he was working with. Sebastian spent the following week conducting his own investigation, but his focus wasn't on gathering more evidence of Victoria's infidelity. Gerald had provided more than enough proof. Instead, Sebastian was mapping the financial landscape of their shared life with the precision of a military strategist. As a senior partner at Whitman and Associates, one of the city's most respected accounting firms, Sebastian understood money the way musicians understood scales. Every transaction told a story, and Victoria's story was becoming clearer with each bank statement he reviewed. She'd been clever, but not clever enough to fool someone who spent his days unraveling complex financial puzzles for corporate clients. The secret account Gerald had discovered was just the beginning. Sebastian found 3 more accounts Victoria had opened over the past year, each funded by modest transfers that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. She'd also been selling jewelry, pieces he'd given her for anniversaries and birthdays, replacing them with convincing replicas. The woman sleeping beside him each night had been running a sophisticated embezzlement operation against their marriage. What impressed Sebastian most wasn't the scale of Victoria's deception, but its patience. She wasn't grabbing everything and running. She was building something sustainable. The money she'd moved would be enough to start fresh somewhere else, but not enough to live lavishly forever. Victoria was planning for a middle-class life with James, not a millionaire's escape fantasy. This realization shaped Sebastian's response. He began making his own financial preparations, but with a different goal entirely. While Victoria was stealing thousands, Sebastian was protecting millions. He started with their jointly owned assets. The house, officially worth $800,000 according to recent appraisals, sat on property that Sebastian knew would be rezoned for commercial development within 18 months. He'd learned this through his connections at City Hall, information that wasn't public yet, but would eventually triple the land's value. Sebastian quietly arranged to transfer his half-ownership to a trust controlled by his sister Margaret, making it appear as though he was divesting assets for tax purposes. Their investment portfolio required more delicate handling. Sebastian began gradually shifting their holdings, moving money into accounts that were technically joint but practically under his sole control. He documented every transaction meticulously, creating a paper trail that would satisfy any future legal scrutiny, while ensuring Victoria would discover her access had been restricted only when it was too late to matter. The most satisfying part of his strategy involved James Morrison directly. Sebastian learned that the tennis instructor supplemented his resort income by giving private lessons to wealthy clients. 3 of those clients were wives of Sebastian's business associates. A few carefully worded conversations during golf games and dinner parties planted seeds of concern about James's unprofessional conduct with married women. Sebastian never mentioned Victoria or his own situation. He simply expressed worry about a friend's wife who developed an inappropriate attachment to her tennis instructor, asking his associates to keep an eye on their own spouses' relationships with their fitness professionals. The suggestion was subtle but effective. Within 2 weeks, James had lost all 3 clients, along with nearly 40% of his supplemental income. Meanwhile, Sebastian maintained his regular routine at home with Oscar-worthy performance. He asked Victoria about her yoga classes, complimented her new perfume, and even suggested they plan a vacation together. Victoria responded with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from genuine guilt, agreeing to every suggestion while probably calculating how to postpone their trip until after she disappeared with James. The breakthrough came during Sebastian's 3rd meeting with his divorce attorney, Patricia Chen. Sebastian had initially consulted Patricia as a precautionary measure, but their conversations had evolved into something more strategic. "The beauty of your situation," Patricia explained over lunch at her favorite downtown restaurant, "is that Victoria doesn't know you know. That gives us enormous leverage in terms of asset protection and settlement negotiation." Sebastian nodded, cutting into his salmon with precise movements. "What if we didn't negotiate at all?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "What if we let her leave exactly the way she's planning to leave, but ensure she takes only what she's already stolen?" "That's unconventional. Most people want to fight for everything." Sebastian smiled for the first time in weeks. "Most people aren't married to someone who's been planning their financial ruin for 8 months. Victoria wants to disappear with James? I'm going to make sure she gets exactly what she's asked for." As he walked back to his office that afternoon, Sebastian felt the satisfaction of a plan finally taking shape. Victoria thought she was writing the ending to their story, but Sebastian was about to show her that the most elegant revenge often looked exactly like getting everything you thought you wanted. The final act began 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening that started like any other. Victoria announced she was attending a weekend yoga retreat upstate, something about deepening her practice and finding inner balance. Sebastian nodded sympathetically, and offered to drive her to the train station, an offer she declined with the kind of nervous laughter that confirmed she'd be nowhere near a yoga mat. Sebastian knew from Gerald's continued surveillance that Victoria and James were planning to fly to California that weekend, where James had supposedly lined up a job at an exclusive resort in Napa Valley. What they didn't know was that the job offer was as fake as Victoria's yoga retreat. Sebastian had arranged for one of his clients, who owned several West Coast properties, to make the offer and then rescind it at the last possible moment. On Friday evening, Sebastian helped Victoria load her suitcase into her car, kissing her goodbye with genuine fondness. After 12 years of marriage, he realized he didn't hate her for what she'd done. In a strange way, he almost admired her ambition. She'd identified what she wanted and pursued it with remarkable dedication. The tragedy was that she'd never stopped to consider whether Sebastian might be equally dedicated to protecting what was his. The call came Saturday morning, just as Sebastian was enjoying coffee and the weekend paper. Victoria's voice was tight with panic. "Sebastian, something terrible has happened. Our accounts. Someone's frozen our accounts." Sebastian set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "What do you mean, frozen?" "I tried to access our savings for something, and everything's been transferred or locked. The bank says they can't discuss it over the phone, but Sebastian, almost everything is gone." "That's impossible," Sebastian said, injecting just the right amount of confusion into his voice. "I was just at the bank yesterday. Let me call them and see what's happening." He could hear James's voice in the background, asking urgent questions. Victoria hushed him before returning to the phone. "Sebastian, I need you to fix this. Whatever's happened, you need to fix it right now." "Of course, darling. Where are you? I'll come to you." The silence stretched long enough for Sebastian to count heartbeats. When Victoria finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. I'm at the airport." "The airport? I thought you were at your yoga retreat." Another pause. Sebastian could practically hear her calculating, trying to determine how much truth she could afford. "I decided to visit my sister in California instead. But Sebastian, if I can't access our money..." "Don't worry," Sebastian said gently. "I'm sure it's just a banking error. These things happen. You go ahead with your trip, and I'll sort everything out from here." After he hung up, Sebastian sat quietly for several minutes, imagining the scene playing out at the airport. Victoria and James, surrounded by luggage they couldn't afford to check, holding tickets to a future that was rapidly dissolving. James would be asking questions Victoria couldn't answer, and Victoria would be realizing that her carefully laid plans had somehow been turned against her. The money Victoria had stolen over 8 months, approximately $47,000 according to Sebastian's calculations, was exactly what she'd be able to access through the accounts she'd hidden from him. It would be enough to get her and James to California, rent a modest apartment, and survive for perhaps 6 months while James looked for work that might or might not exist. Meanwhile, the assets Victoria thought she'd have access to, their joint savings, the house equity, the investment portfolio, were now either protected in trusts or locked behind legal mechanisms that would take years to penetrate, even with the best divorce attorney. Sebastian's phone rang again that evening. Victoria's number, but when he answered, a man's voice spoke. "Is this Sebastian Clarke?" "Speaking." "This is James Morrison. I think you know who I am." Sebastian smiled. "Yes, I believe I do." "How can I help you, James?" "Your wife, Victoria. She says there's been some kind of banking error, but the numbers don't add up. What she told me about your finances, what she promised, none of it's real, is it?" "I'm not sure what Victoria promised you," Sebastian said truthfully, "but I can tell you that she's free to leave our marriage anytime she chooses. She'll leave with exactly what belongs to her." The line went quiet, except for the sound of airport announcements in the background. "The thing is," James continued, his voice smaller now, "I lost my job. My main job, I mean. The resort let me go last week, and the private clients. They all canceled. Victoria said we'd be fine. That money wouldn't be a problem, but now you're discovering that sometimes the people we trust aren't quite who we thought they were." Sebastian finished gently. I'm sorry you're learning that lesson the hard way, James. I recently learned it myself. Sebastian hung up and poured himself a glass of wine, a bottle he and Victoria had been saving for their 13th anniversary. As he sat in his study, surrounded by the financial documents that represented his successful defense of everything he'd built, Sebastian felt a profound sense of closure. Victoria had gotten exactly what she'd asked for: freedom from their marriage and enough money to start over with the man she loved. The fact that enough money turned out to be far less than she'd expected, and that the man she loved was now unemployed and questioning her honesty, were simply natural consequences of the choices she'd made. Sebastian raised his glass to the empty room. "To Victoria," he said aloud, "and to getting exactly what we deserve." The next morning, Sebastian would call his attorney and begin the divorce proceedings that Victoria had been too cowardly to initiate herself. But tonight, he was simply a man who'd learned that the most satisfying revenge wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about giving them precisely what they thought they wanted, and letting them discover the difference between fantasy and reality on their own.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more interesting content coming soon.